Welcome everybody. Welcome to the Permit to Kill live stream hosted by Sierra Club and Greenpeace USA. We'll get started here in a second as more people join. Really excited to see everybody. If you can, as we get going here, find the chat feature in whatever platform you're in and say hi. Let us know where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear from you. I know we have a couple watch parties happening in Southwest Louisiana and other parts of the Gulf. So big welcome to everybody there. And we'll get started here in just a second. So yeah, find that chat button and let us know where you're tuning in from. We'll get started here in just a second. Hey, Boulder, Colorado. We've got Portland, Oregon. Welcome. Love to see the folks in Sulphur, Louisiana. Welcome. Good to see you. All right. San Antonio, welcome. Good to see you. All right, let's get started here. My name is Roddy Hughes. I'm an organizing strategist for the Sierra Club's Beyond Dirty Fuels campaign. I'm part of a powerful coalition fighting oil and gas exports in the Gulf Coast region of Texas and Louisiana. We're here tonight because Sierra Club and Greenpeace, Analyst published a report called Permit to Kill that quantifies the health impacts that LNG or methane gas exports are having on Gulf communities. The report findings are clear. The so-called natural gas that industry wants you to believe is clean and part of the climate solution is anything but. Their process of freezing and exporting methane gas kills people. As we'll get to in a minute, the Senate is considering legislation that would fast-track the approval of more LNG export terminals. That expansion would double the number of premature deaths caused every year and results in billions of dollars in healthcare costs. The bill, sponsored, of course, by Joe Manchin, has enough energy transition reform stuff in it that it's getting support from some Democrats. But we're not going to let this bill pass. We're not going to let any politicians trade people's lives so that corporations can continue generating wealth for their executives and shareholders. We've got some great speakers tonight. Great lineup, a lot of really smart people. Claire Dorner from Sierra Club is going to start us off with some context of how we got to this place. My good friend John Beard is going to talk about the impacts of air pollution are having on his hometown of Port Arthur, Texas. Dr. Robin Saha will talk about the report the Bullard Center produced this year about the environmental justice implications of the LNG build-out. Joe and Andreas from Sierra Club and Greenpeace are going to present their report, Permit to Kill, which details the health impacts of LNG exports. Then Claire's going to come back on at the end and talk about the Manchin permitting reform bill and how you can join the fight to stop it. We're live streaming tonight from several platforms, YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, StreamYard. No matter how you're turned in, we want your questions. So throughout the night, as they pop in your head, pull up the chat, drop in your questions. We have some awesome team members keeping track, and we'll answer as many at the end as we can. If we don't get to them all, we're going to type up an FAQ sheet and share that around. With that, again, welcome to the live stream. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Claire, who will kind of get us started here. Go ahead, Claire.
Hey everyone, I'm Claire Dorner. I'm with the Sierra Club on our federal policy team, and I do legislative and administrative advocacy on LNG exports. We can go to the next slide. And so we're going to talk about how we got here with LNG exports in the U.S. And I also will catch everyone up to speed on what LNG exports are. Next slide. So LNG stands for liquefied natural gas, which in reality is just methane gas that has been branded by the fossil fuel industry as natural gas. So we will always, from this point on, be referring to it as LNG or methane gas. The non-liquid version of this gas is sent through pipelines, and it's the same gas that heats your homes, provides electricity for manufacturers, and that we use to cook. You might have heard that this gas is more clean burning than coal, but that's just when we're looking at right where it burns at the source. And when we look at emissions along the supply chain, it's a much different story, and there are over a dozen carcinogens that are burned at the source of methane gas. So the past decade has seen an enormous rise in proposals to build the terminals that cool, liquefy, and then export U.S. methane gas, or LNG, overseas. This started after the fracking boom of the 2000s, which unlocked a lot of new supply of methane gas. And so the United States really only started exporting LNG as of 2016. And now, just a few years later, we are the world's largest exporter of LNG. So to talk a bit about the life cycle of LNG, exporting this gas across the ocean requires the gas to be cooled to a liquid state. Then it is loaded onto enormous tankers that you can see a visual of one of those on the slide. And then it is shipped to markets primarily in Asia and Europe. The life cycle of this methane gas is long. It's extracted through fracking, sent along the pipeline to these terminals, cooled down, sent onto a tanker, and then sent overseas. And then it is finally unloaded at an import terminal at its location, where it is regasified and then sent down a pipeline to the end user. And so, the more steps we add to the supply chain, the more opportunities there are for methane leakage to happen and enter our atmosphere, which is a huge problem because methane has an 80 times higher warming potential than CO2. Just over a shorter period of time. So when we're thinking about our short-term climate commitments, the ones that really matter through 2030, through 2050, to avert rising global temperatures and climate catastrophe, methane emissions and reducing those are really the most important thing we can do right now. And also just to mention, volatile chemicals are released during the liquefying and regasifying processes, which are known causes of respiratory disease and cancer. So that really impacts the communities that live nearby. Next slide. So in terms of location, there are 9 operating terminals, 6 under construction, and 26 planned. They're mostly concentrated along the Gulf Coast, affecting coastal communities of color in Louisiana and Texas. The facilities threaten ecosystems, they threaten local industries like tourism and fishing, as well as the global climate. And a lot of these communities are already overburdened by other petrochemical industry pollution and climate change fueled disasters. Next slide, please. So LNG exports are also threatening our climate commitments. LNG exports from the US have more than quadrupled since 2018, and our current LNG export capacity as it stands right now is expected to double by 2028. There have been billions of dollars invested in this rapid expansion, and that has come at the expense of safer, more reliable, and cleaner renewable energy alternatives that could benefit communities and allow us to meet our climate commitments. Ultimately, if all planned and under construction LNG terminals in the US come online and begin operating, it would erase a huge portion of US climate progress. In 2030, emitting more than 1/3 of what will be reduced by the Inflation Reduction Act through those measures. And also, that doesn't even take into consideration the emissions that would come from end users abroad burning the methane gas and utilizing it. That wouldn't even count towards those emissions. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about the Department of Energy and what role it plays in LNG exports. DOE is the entity that determines whether or not exports are in the public interest and authorizes LNG to be exported to countries where we do not have a free trade agreement. Free trade agreement countries already automatically get gas export approvals, but DOE has to deem LNG exports to be in the public interest or not in order for them to go to non-FTA countries. They are supposed to deny them essentially if LNG exports are found to not be in the public interest. So this review of how we ship LNG exports or not to non-FTA countries is supposed to require a very in-depth analysis of the economic and climate impacts of LNG exports, as well as the potential harms to human health and the environment. Historically, these reviews from DOE have taken about 6 months. Next slide, please. So despite that requirement, there so far has been very little consideration given by DOE to the impact on local communities, domestic energy consumers, and the climate when it comes to approving LNG export authorizations. For instance, it's a known direct correlation that the more we export LNG, the higher domestic energy prices become for us at home across the country. And that is the reason that we've seen this lack of consideration from DOE thus far is because DOE has been making their public interest determinations based on outdated studies from the Trump administration that are flawed and don't consider very critical aspects like environmental justice at all. Next slide, please. So right now, DOE is in a very interesting, critical time where they are updating the studies that inform the public interest determination on exporting LNG. Until now, DOE has never rejected an LNG export authorization, but because they are updating those Trump-era studies, we hope that eventually, once those studies are completed, it will lead to the first ever rejection. And therefore a lack of expansion of LNG exports. Those studies are due to be released in March of 2025, and the studies we know will consider environmental justice, climate, economy, and more. And we believe that it's very vital that DOE take this time to update its own analyses and criteria that it uses to determine what is in the public's interest, and that we maintain DOE's authority to have the freedom to conduct these reviews when they need to on their own timeline, especially when we're talking about LNG projects that take years to build and then are permitted to operate for decades, sometimes 50 years. Next slide, thank you all. And right there are some resources that I highly recommend you click on. There are some press releases and articles from Sierra Club that kind of talk about the state of play more in depth of LNG exports in the US, as well as a fact sheet on the Energy Permitting Reform Act that we will talk about shortly. And I will draw connections between what we know about LNG exports in DOE and why we are trying to gain opposition of this Energy Permitting Act.
Thank you so much, Claire. Good stuff. Good stuff. Methane gas is such a major threat to our climate, and in the front line communities along the Gulf, we will stop this massive build out. So again, just a reminder, throughout any point in this presentation, please drop your questions in the chat. We really want to hear from you. We've got a lot of people on. Last count I saw was we're over a couple hundred. So a lot of people tuning in. Welcome. Love to see you. Our next speaker is a really good friend of mine. John Beard is a lifelong resident of Port Arthur, Texas, who's worked in oil refineries. He served on the Port Arthur City Council and even acted as the mayor pro tem of Port Arthur. Over the last several years, he served as the founder and CEO of the Port Arthur Community Action Network. He's an amazing storyteller. And in recent years, he's traveled the world advocating that industry stop sacrificing communities like Port Arthur. It's a joy to have him on tonight. John, welcome.
Thank you, Roddy, and good evening to all of you out there. Glad to have you aboard. And this is indeed, as the title says, a permit to kill. It's essentially giving the oil and gas companies a license to harm not only communities here on the Gulf Coast, and not only those communities where the gas is extracted from the ground, but also to other parts of the world where this gas is going to be shipped. There is a trail of damage that you can find to people, their lives, and their communities. And nothing matters more to anyone, I would say, than the life of your family, or your life, or that of your community and where you live. And we all have a right to breathe clean air, to live in a safe and secure neighborhood, and not have to be worried by the burden of some company using a gas that could potentially harm you and harm the entire planet. So once again, thank you for having me here this evening to speak to this issue. And I want to talk to you about the impact on frontline communities like Port Arthur that have been affected by this. The oil and gas industry, as we know in Texas and pretty much in America, began in 1901 with the spindle top gusher coming in to a little town called Beaumont, Texas, just north of Port Arthur. And in 3 years, the first refineries were built. The ExxonMobil refinery, which I formerly worked for, which is the second largest refinery in the country, and 2 more refineries were built, two in Port Arthur, the Gulf Oil Company, which is now Valero, and Motiva, which is now the largest refinery in the country. And because of this build out of these refineries and many other associated petrochemical plants, the Southeast Texas area has been long overburdened by air pollution, by noise, by toxins that have been released, and by all of the things that this industry brings with it in the course of creating oil and gas and the various products. And currently, Port Arthur is home to potentially 3 LNG facilities, one of which is already working just right across Lake Sabine in Louisiana, which, by the way, borders Port Arthur and Louisiana. We're essentially on the border. So if you don't have a map handy, just kind of imagine in your mind where Texas and Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico meet. Well, that's where Port Arthur is. And because of the proximity of petrochemical plants, as well as the Sabine Neches Waterway, which is a major U.S. waterway for shipping oil and gas, we've become home to potentially 3 LNG facilities. Cheniere's Sabine Pass LNG, which is currently operating and is one of the largest export facilities in the country, and 2 others, Golden Pass LNG, which is an ExxonMobil project, which is being converted from an import facility to an export facility, and lastly, Sempra's Port Arthur LNG. I'd rather call it Sempra LNG because I don't like my home city being named after something so deadly and so potentially poisonous and hazardous to human life. But the danger is in the air. It's in the release of the gases and toxins that it takes to gasify this gas and ship it, but also the petrochemical industry in itself. Because currently, Port Arthur has some of the worst air quality in the nation. We're in the 95th percentile, which means only 5% of the cities in the whole country have worse air than we do. And a recent study that came from the United Nations says that Port Arthur is one of the most heavily contaminated places on the planet. So with all of this and the effects it has on the life and health of people, which has manifested itself in 2 cancer clusters, with also being double the state and national average for the occurrence of cancer in the population, and also heart, lung, and kidney disease, and lowered life expectancy, then you would think something this dangerous would not be being produced and shipped elsewhere and coming through Port Arthur, but it is. And so these illnesses and these diseases and the pollution that caused them are a threat. It is indeed, as I said earlier, a permit to kill, because these companies cannot operate with permits that allow them to do the very thing that is harming not only Port Arthur, but Lake Charles, Louisiana, Freeport, Texas, Brownsville, Texas, and as well as Corpus Christi, Texas, and numerous other places. There are a number of these facilities planned all up and down the Gulf Coast. And pretty soon it will be coming soon to a community near you. And what this means is that the effects of this pollution will not only affect those communities, but it will affect the entire planet. And it will also affect us in terms of climate change, global warming, and also the recent storms that we've had. So once again, this is a permit to kill, and we have to find a way to stop the deadly cost of fracked gas exports, which is not only harming us here in America, but potentially has the ability to harm the whole planet and destroy entire communities and entire countries. So thank you for having this opportunity to speak to you today with regard to this.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate your time tonight. Very powerful. I want to reiterate something that John said. This isn't just about Port Arthur. Cameron, Louisiana, small community just across the border, a few miles away, already home to a couple of these massive facilities with many more planned. Freeport, Texas, Corpus Christi, Texas, Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, Brownsville, all targets of these of the LNG industry. And of course, the impacts fall disproportionately on low-income communities of color. So This is very much a justice issue. It's a climate issue. I'm really excited about our next speaker. Dr. Robin Saha is one of the co-authors of a report, Liquefying the Gulf Coast. It's a report published by the Texas Southern University Robert D. Bullard Center for Environmental and Climate Justice. The report details the cumulative impacts of the LNG build-out in Texas and Louisiana, and the disparate impacts imposed on environmental justice communities. Dr. Saha is an associate professor and director of environmental studies at the University of Montana and a leading scholar activist on environmental justice, health, and policy, with an emphasis on community engagement and empowerment. We're really excited to have you here, Dr. Saha. I'll turn it over to you.
Greetings. Thank you, Roddy, and thanks to the Sierra Club and Greenpeace for organizing this event. And those of you who are participating, hope your snack bowls are holding out. I had the pleasure of working on this project with Dr. Bullard of the Bullard Center and a co-author, Dr. Liza Powers, who I believe is on the call today. And we were interested in trying to understand how liquid natural gas connects to, sort of the history of sacrifice zones in the Gulf South. And we understood that this development of LNG is just another iteration of petrochemical development in the Gulf South that's impacting people of color and low-income communities. And it's adding, insult to injury, essentially. We have, this is an extensive report, and I'm just going to give some highlights of it. And as the data guy on the report, I'm going to show you some graphs. And all the things that John Beard mentioned are absolutely true, and I'll put some figures behind some of that. One thing that's important to understand is that petrochemical development has been going on, oil and gas development is going on the Gulf Coast for 100 years or so. It's responsible for subsidence and loss of protective wetlands along the Gulf Coast, and for all sorts of environmental damage through canaling and oil spills that we know about. And then, of course, there's the Cancer Alley and other large petrochemical complexes across the Gulf South. Next slide. So keeping that in mind, we wanted to take stock of the sort of the additive impact of LNG, considering what the communities are already dealing with there. And so we developed this cumulative impact framework for looking at the totality of environmental and health burdens on the community that LNG adds to. So part of the approach that we took was to look at a subset of the facilities that are both currently operating in construction and in the pipeline, and do a deep dive on them, including some individual case studies that Dr. Powers worked on quite a bit to try to bring the human element to this and adding to the some of the quantitative data. But what the report does is looks at some of the pre-existing environmental burdens. Some of them I already talked about with the environmental destruction and the air pollution and hazardous waste that's resulted from decades of petrochemical development. We wanted to do an environmental justice analysis of these particular facilities as well. We reviewed the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's EJ analysis and found tremendous flaws with them. And those you can find in the report. I don't know if someone's put in the chat the link to the report, but it's there. I just put it in. And we were interested then in looking at whether and the extent to which vulnerable communities and populations were located who would be more susceptible to the pollution and noise of LNG, and as well as the environmental impacts, and then the risks of climate change and climate hazards to LNG itself, and then finally the impacts of climate change. So I'm going to buzz through some of these things and just hit some of the highlights and suggest that you look at the report if you want more details. So next slide. So in terms of pre-existing environmental burdens, this is a little busy of a chart, but we used EPA's EJ screen that has about 12 or 13 environmental indicators: particulate matter, air cancer risk, respiratory hazards, traffic proximity, proximity to Superfund sites, and RMP facilities, or facilities that store and use large amounts of explosive and hazardous chemicals, etc. And what we found is that these are showing the percentiles for each of the facilities. And so anything over 50% means that that particular environmental indicator is above the national average. And so we see tremendous amounts of high levels of, especially around Freeport and around, looks like Driftwood, which is over by Cameron, high levels of air pollution and hazardous waste proximity, etc. These communities are already suffering from tremendous environmental burdens and should not be exposed to more air pollution from LNG. These fence line communities, as John Beard was mentioning, in Louisiana already rank high in adult cancer, asthma, and obesity rates. Areas with high asthma are places where there should be more protection, not added pollution from LNG. Texas also ranks high. Texas LNG's areas around them, we looked at 3-mile areas around these facilities, also rank high for adult asthma and obesity rates. There's also issues around healthcare access and preventative health. Next. So what we're seeing is that these communities already have social and health vulnerabilities. In looking at the racial composition, we can see that the blue bar is showing the percentage of people of color in areas around the LNG facilities, and this is just looking at these 5, including the Freeport pretreatment. So we can see 4 out of 5 of them have very high percentages of people of color, over 80%, right around 80%, 60, 70%, much higher than the states they're in, much higher than the national average. There can be no doubt that LNG is an environmental justice issue, and that the communities such as Corpus Christi that don't have high percentages of people of color, relatively high. I mean, 41% still high, but compared to Texas, it's not high. But they still have high rates of poverty, family poverty rates, and the schools around these LNG facilities are also have much higher levels of air toxics exposure. And so there's a lot of concern that about children's health, health of vulnerable populations, people with pre-existing health conditions, all are concentrated around these LNG facilities. Next. So this category of impacts is a little bit too involved to look to discuss today in detail, but we looked at these 6 categories of impacts, and needless to say, they're pretty significant across the board. LNG has a very large footprint on the environment. These terminals are all located at coastal locations where there's environmentally sensitive areas, including wetlands that are being destroyed, and tremendous amounts of dredging going on. That in some cases, areas such as in Calcasieu Channel, where there are contaminated sediments at the bottom that they're disturbing. This has a tremendous impact on commercial and recreational fishing. Many who are African Americans, small businesses that are affected, and there's enough dredging going on there. You can see in the slide to fill over 4 superdomes, and this is just from the 6 facilities that we examined. So environmental impacts are pretty significant to wildlife as well. Okay, next slide. So one thing that I think is important to recognize is, and I think we're seeing it just too much in the news nowadays, of hurricanes, major storms, increasing in severity and intensity, causing technological failures. There was a major damage to the facility in Freeport from just a windstorm. It wasn't even a big storm. There was an explosion there as a result. These facilities are not well regulated. The companies don't have much incentive to install good warning systems. In many cases, the operators are not well trained. And so with the case of Freeport, we saw it was knocked out for 8 months or so. A huge explosion rocked the community, knocked children out of their baby seats. And with sea level rise occurring much more in the Gulf than anywhere else in the country, there's the added impact of high tide flooding occurring more frequently, and then storm surges having an increasing impact. It's sort of an unknown what can happen to these facilities in the face of a large hurricane. Only 3 of the 6 have been designed to withstand a Category 3 hurricane, or sorry, a Category 5 hurricane, and we really don't know what the rest can withstand. So it's a really big crapshoot what's going on, and what will happen. What would have happened if the last 2 hurricanes that hit Florida hit a little further to the west? What would have happened to these facilities? Mapping in our report shows that many of them would be under 9 feet of water, with just even a Category 3 or 4 storm surge. So there's very big concerns too about tornadoes. They have not been evaluated. The chances of a puncture of one of these tanks, if they exploded, it could cause a leakage of liquid natural gas that would volatilize and could catch fire, impacting areas up to 4.5 miles. Okay, next slide, please. And I think it's important too to consider the climate impacts of LNG. I know that Claire referred to that at her opening, and there's a few studies that have been done on that. These facilities use a tremendous amount of energy. There you can see that Corpus Christi has 1,843,000 horsepower compressors, tremendous amount of energy to compress and cool the methane gas. Excuse me if I said natural gas. And there's tremendous amounts of leakage of methane and flaring in the Permian Basin, where a lot of this methane is extracted through fracking. So when you consider the life cycle emissions, including the emissions from shipping and the end use, this technology is something that should be going the way of coal. It's not if it's a transition fuel, we're being fooled. We need to transition to renewables, and it's very clear from international scientists, the International Energy Agency, that we need to be reducing methane use drastically and quickly instead of what we're doing right now, which is increasing production, which really does not benefit the American consumer at all. It benefits the investors, the shareholders for these companies, while the impacts and very few jobs come back to the communities themselves. I think that might be it for me, but thank you again for listening and for the opportunity to share about the report Liquefying the Gulf Coast. And I hope you can take a look, and I'm excited to hear about the new study that takes a deep dive into the health impacts. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Saha. We're so grateful for your work, and just a huge shout out to all our friends and colleagues at the Bullard Center. I know a lot of people worked on liquefying the Gulf Coast, and y'all's findings, the report helps prove what we already know, that LNG is not clean, It's not natural. It is not a climate solution. And it hurts people. And yeah, a big shout out. Thank you, Melanie, for bringing in Dr. Powers. Dr. Liza Powers does a lot of great work for the region, had a huge role in this study, and just really grateful for all the work there. So thank you so much. In August, Joe and Andreas, along with others at Sierra Club and Greenpeace, published Permit to Kill, detailing the health impacts of the LNG build out. I've been involved in the LNG fight for a while now, for a few years. And since I started, we've talked about health impacts, but we've never had the data or the modeling to back it up. And the alphabet soup of permitting agencies have always deferred to industry claims the gas is clean and safe. Permit to Kill proves what we've known all along, that the costs of FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and DOE approving new LNG export terminals can be measured in lives lost, in millions and billions of dollars in annual healthcare expenses. One of the pleasures of working at Sierra Club, and I imagine Greenpeace too, is being surrounded by a lot of smart people. And in that crowd of smart people, the analysts like Joe and Andreas, are kind of next level. When Sierra Club attorneys write their briefs or federal policy folks show up at meetings on the Hill, it's always with data and numbers that the analysts have aggregated or at least vetted. They're not the public face of either organization, but I guarantee you their fingerprints are on everything that we say and do. And as Joe, I just want to remind you all, as Joe and Andreas present their findings, remember John Beard's stories and kind of the community impacts, because the data points are actually real lives. And so just keep that in mind. And I'm so happy to present Joe and Andreas. Take it away, guys.
Thank you so much for setting us up like that, Roddy, John, Claire, Dr. Saha. It's really important, like Roddy just said, to understand that the research we're talking about connects to real lives, and also to be constantly thinking about what we can do about it, because the goal of this research is to help us fight back against the LNG industry build out. What I'm going to share is an overview of research that Joe, myself, and colleagues worked on that focuses on the air pollution impacts of the LNG terminal build out. Now, air pollution is a compelling issue to focus on because there's such a strong body of scientific evidence linking air pollution to negative health outcomes like premature death. And moreover, there's a history in this country of fossil fuel racism, where polluting fossil fuel infrastructure is unfairly cited near Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. So the rapid growth of the LNG industry along the Gulf Coast, which has been such a focal point for environmental injustices for decades, raises concerns that this pattern will continue unless we fight back. Johanna and I are going to be sharing from a report that we called Permit to Kill, and we named it this because it shows that the permits dealt by state and federal agencies that allow for LNG exports are effectively just that. Next slide, please. The main goal of our research was to quantify the potential health impacts of LNG terminal air pollution. The terminals that actually liquefy and ship out this gas are absolutely massive, and they are major sources of air pollutants of all kinds. The secondary goal was to understand the health benefits that would be achieved if we could force the government to stop issuing new LNG export authorizations. And this is because, like we heard earlier from Claire, the Biden-Harris administration in January announced a temporary pause on new LNG export authorizations while it updates some critical technical studies that inform how it determines if LNG exports are in the public interest. Next slide, please. With that in mind, we wanted to go broad with our analysis. So we looked at 32 LNG projects that included currently operating projects, as well as many projects that are under construction and planned. Some of the planned projects that we looked at have their export authorizations already, but others do not. So these are the projects that would be affected by the pause or a moratorium on new export authorizations. Note also that a single LNG terminal could have multiple projects, and that's because the terminals can gradually expand in phases, and each phase or each project that is under one terminal needs to get its own permits. And you can see from this map that, for example, there are 4 projects nested under Corpus Christi, including 2 that are currently operating, 1 that's under construction and 1 that's planned, just to help you read this. And although 3 of the projects we looked at were in Maryland, Georgia, and Florida, because we wanted to get as broad of a look at the LNG industry as possible, all the others are in Texas and Louisiana. Next slide, please. In this slide, I'll talk briefly about how we conducted the analysis. So what we did was first gather air permits for each LNG project. These permits have information about the maximum allowed emissions for specific pollutants called criteria air pollutants that are released by the LNG terminals. We then combined all of this information into a database of permitted emissions levels per project. And using this, we could create build-out scenarios that allow for examining the impacts caused as more and more projects come online under different policy assumptions. Lastly, we ran the permitted emissions data from our database through a health risk screening tool that's maintained by the US EPA. And the tool that they put out there, it's called COBRA. It allows you to basically input changes in air pollution from almost any sector and location. And based on those changes, it estimates changes in air quality in every county in the lower 48 states. So smog, for instance. And based on these changes in air quality at every county, it calculates the health impacts that are caused by improved or worsened air quality. So in some ways, it's a very powerful and complicated tool. In other ways, it's quite simple. You input emissions from a specific sector or location, and the tool tells you what kind of health impacts could result. And the body of science that backs this up is very strong. Next slide. Here I'll talk about some of the very high-level findings from our research. Next slide. So first, looking at currently operating projects, the results of the analysis were striking. We found that permitted emissions from currently operating projects are estimated to cause 60 premature deaths and health impacts equivalent to $957 million just for a single year of emissions. And keep in mind that LNG terminals owners plan to operate these projects for decades. So this is just from a single year's worth of emissions. Next slide. If you look at all of the projects that were in our sample, including those that are under construction and planned, but not currently operating, the numbers increased to 149 premature deaths and health impacts equivalent to $2.33 billion per year of emissions. So there is really a lot at stake with these projects that are planned and not yet underway. And this is on top of the impacts caused by operating projects, which we know are already far too high. Next slide, please. We also ran a scenario analysis, which I mentioned earlier, and that looks at how new LNG projects coming online over time will, the impacts that these will have. we created 3 different scenarios that have different policy assumptions underlying them to help draw out this comparison. On the figure on the left, you'll see 3 lines, 1 line for each scenario. The blue line shows a scenario just operating projects. The red line shows a scenario where operating projects and projects that have their export authorizations come online. So that includes projects that are under construction and planned and have this critical federal authorization to proceed, but are not operating yet. And the yellow line shows a full build-out scenario where all of the projects in our analysis come online, including those projects that don't yet have authorization. What this chart shows is that there starts to be a really big difference across these scenarios in the late 2020s. And that's because there are many new projects expected to come online at that point in time. And some of them have their authorizations and their permits already. That's shown by the red line. Others are planned but don't have their permits yet. And just to put it into cumulative terms, on a cumulative basis between 2023 and 2050, the full build-out scenario here causes 4,470 premature deaths. So it is a really staggering degree of impact that the industry could be having here. I'll pass it over to Joe for the next part of this presentation.
Thanks so much, Andres, and everyone that spoke before. And hello to everyone tuning in. Next slide, please. As Andres mentioned, the COBRA tool allowed for us to look at these health and economic impacts per US county as well. So we set about trying to answer the question, who will experience these health impacts? And moreover, are these communities already overburdened or facing environmental injustice? Next slide, please. We looked ahead to the year 2030 when almost all of the LNG projects are slated to become operational. And we found that Gulf South communities, both near and far from LNG terminals, are slated to suffer some of the worst impacts from LNG air pollution. These communities are primarily counties and parishes in Southwest Louisiana and the Texas Gulf Coast, near where LNG terminals are clustered, but also counties and parishes much further inland in Texas and Louisiana. We identified the counties and parishes with the highest premature deaths. That's what's shown on the map here. For counties and parishes with perhaps smaller populations, but slated to experience high LNG air pollution, these have the highest premature deaths per million, and that's shown in the map in the light blue. Counties and parishes with the highest premature deaths total or in absolute terms are shown in green, and counties and parishes with the highest combined premature deaths in absolute and per million terms are shown here in the dark teal. Next slide, please. We then focus some of our analysis on these 35 most impacted counties and parishes. For one of our analyses, we use the Climate Vulnerability Index, or CVI, developed by the Environmental Defense Fund and Texas A&M University. You can think of the CVI as a rank that compares all counties in the US by looking at each county's socioeconomic and sociodemographic characteristics, health outcomes, pollution exposure, and climate and environmental conditions and risks. So the CVI rank is a cumulative assessment aimed to determine the community's vulnerability to the climate crisis and its overall overburden. When applying it to the counties and parishes most impacted by LNG air pollution, what we found is that the majority of these counties and parishes rank above the CVI 82nd percentile, meaning that they are more climate vulnerable and overall more overburdened than 82% of the US. Taking this a step further, the majority of counties and parishes that have both high total premature deaths and premature deaths per million due to LNG air pollution, these rank at the CVI 99th percentile, meaning they are among the most climate vulnerable and overburdened communities in the United States. So not only does the LNG industry exacerbate the climate crisis that these communities are extremely vulnerable to, these already overburdened communities could also potentially face deadly LNG air pollution. Next slide, please. For the final analysis I'd like to highlight, we looked at LNG air pollution exposure for different racial and ethnic groups for the entire population of the contiguous United States. We found that nationally, Black and Hispanic Americans were exposed to LNG air pollution at higher rates than white Americans, with Black Americans having an LNG air pollution exposure rate 151 to 170% that of white Americans, and Hispanic Americans having an LNG air pollution exposure rate 110 to 129% the rate of white Americans. This shows a disproportionate impact among these groups and a continuation of a disturbing trend of the fossil fuel industry, where Black and Brown Americans often face the worst of its impacts. As Professor Saha presented earlier, there's a lot more work that needs to be done when examining the impacts to communities and conducting a comprehensive environmental justice review. Our report is a start at looking at direct LNG air pollution impacts, and we hope permitting agencies and others investigate health and cumulative impacts further. Next slide, please. So I'd like to summarize the key findings in the Permit to Kill report within the context of permitting. If the DOE were to no longer approve LNG export authorizations, the cumulative health benefits through the year 2050 are huge. In addition to avoiding up to 1,000 premature deaths, there can be over 3,000 new cases of childhood asthma prevented, over 500,000 asthma symptoms could be avoided, over 200,000 lost school days could be avoided, over 3,000 lost work days can be avoided, and many more health benefits, all an equivalent of $10 to $15 billion. And I'll close by saying decisions made today about LNG approvals will have impacts on the health and livelihood of folks in the Gulf South region for decades to come. Later on, my colleague Claire will share some ways that we can mobilize to make sure that the right decisions are made and that the Gulf South and our planet are protected. Thank you so much for joining us.
Wow, thanks y'all. Amazing work, amazing work. You know, this is the cost of the LNG build out, right? 60 deaths a year, hundreds of millions of dollars, and almost $1 billion of year, healthcare expenses. And unless we stop Joe Manchin's permitting reform bill, those impacts could more than double. So let's get Claire back on for a few minutes and get into details about the bill and how we're going to stop it. Welcome back, Claire. Good to see you.
Thanks, Roddy. For those of you who were not on the call when I first joined, my name is Claire Dorner. I'm with the Sierra Club on our federal policy team. I specialize in LNG exports and do advocacy around that. Thank you so much, Joe and Andres, for discussing the health costs and implications of LNG. I would love to talk about the Joe Manchin, his Energy Permitting Reform Act of 2024, how it ties into everything that you've heard so far and how we can take action around this. Next slide, please. So what is the permit reform bill? So Senators Joe Manchin and John Barrasso introduced the Energy Permitting Reform Act of 2024 in July of this year. And now they are trying to push what we like to call the dirty deal through Congress. And we call it that because it would be a massive giveaway to the fossil fuel industry. And actually, a lot of it mirrors much of Project 2025. However, the bill is unfortunately gaining a lot of traction on both sides of the aisle because it has provisions in it that would boost build out of clean energy and transmission infrastructure needed to support it. But we have a lot more context on why this bill is more than worth opposing. So what this bill would do, and I think we'll be dropping some fact sheets in the chat shortly. This legislation would cause irreparable damage to our communities and our climate through a few different ways. One of them is opening up federal lands and waters to further oil and gas leasing. Also, it would severely restrict judicial review and really limit the ability for communities and organizations to stand up against fossil fuel industry and different projects. So if this bill were to be passed, it would prevent stakeholders, local governments, impacted communities from holding the government accountable. Specifically, Title I would shorten the statute of limitations under the Administrative Procedures Act to just 150 days. So just within a few months, different communities would have to file a suit against the fossil fuel industry or otherwise lose their chance to file at all. And finally, this bill would fast track or even eliminate the review of proposed LNG exports. Next slide, please. So how would it fast track LNG? So as I mentioned before, the Biden administration and the Department of Energy are currently updating studies from the Trump era to understand how LNG exports should or should not be approved depending on the public interest determination. The last time these studies were updated, again, was under the Trump administration in 2018. And these studies are inaccurate and they're obsolete, meaning that DOE does not have currently the proper information it needs to make an informed decision about whether or not LNG exports are in the public interest using those studies. So DOE has kind of decided to wait on approving any new LNG export authorizations until they finish these studies because they want to only make decisions moving forward with the best possible information. And as I mentioned before, these studies are not expected to be released until the first quarter of 2025, around March, because DOE is taking so much time to gather public comment and really assess these studies to make sure that it reflects environmental justice considerations. So the timeline around this bill is that, or a critical provision of this bill around DOE's timeline is that the bill would permanently restrict DOE's authority to review LNG exports by forcing essentially automatic approval after 90 days, or only giving DOE 90 days to decide to deny an LNG export authorization. And if you'll recall, I previously mentioned that this process to understand the impacts of a proposed LNG export authorization has previously taken 6 months. So to push that through this bill to be 90 days instead does not allow DOE to have enough time to assess the full scope of environmental, community, and economic harms of LNG exports. Therefore, DOE would essentially be forced to approve export applications. Additionally, if this bill were to be passed and signed into law before January 2025, which is what we're anticipating at this time, it would force DOE to review at least 5 major new LNG export authorizations on that 90-day time period based on the outdated Trump era studies that don't consider environmental justice at all. They would have to decide within 90 days of the bill being passed, and therefore they would not have enough time to complete these updated studies that they're working on that will be released in the first quarter of 2025. So they would have to use the old Trump era studies, which again are not very comprehensive and don't give a lot of evidence that we know exists, but isn't formerly written by DOE that LNG exports are not in the public interest whatsoever. These 5 terminals that would be decided on would lead to a 40% increase in LNG processing capacity above what is already operating or under construction. And the life cycle emissions of just those 5 terminals would be equivalent to over 160 coal power plants. So that would essentially, negate the benefits of any clean electricity transmission projects from the bill. And at the very least, it would make our climate commitments virtually impossible and sacrifice already overburdened communities that you see are suffering a lot of impacts from this build out. So this bill is also showcasing a very counterintuitive approach. There is a fundamental conflict between reducing fossil fuel demand by boosting transmission and clean energy, simultaneously approving this long lifespan fossil fuel infrastructure that increases fossil fuel supply. You can't do both at the same time. Policies need to decrease fossil fuel supply and demand in order to effectively reduce emissions and ensure that we're not sacrificing communities. And also it's worth noting that there are bills like CETA and the Environmental Justice for All Act that have the positives of boosting transmission and clean energy showcased in this bill without giveaways to the fossil fuel industry. Sorry, one moment. And so it really does not have to be this way. Next slide, please. So there has been opposition to this bill. So 118 scientists this week wrote a letter to Congress opposing the bill, and that's available on Twitter. They criticized the non-peer-reviewed modeling from this bill that claims that the renewable energy and transmission provisions will yield overall emissions reductions that would be greater than the emissions increases from the fossil fuel provisions of the bill. However, the modeling has a lot of flaws, and it fails to take into account the full global life cycle of fossil fuels, particularly of the burning of LNG that is exported abroad, and what those emissions look like, in addition to the exported crude oil, petroleum, and coal. We simply cannot export our emissions footprint elsewhere and expect things to improve. And additionally, even if these models were accurate in that overall through the bill there would be a net emissions reduction, a reduction does not mean that we are able to meet our climate commitments. We have to drastically reduce our emissions by getting off of fossil fuels through a just transition. And additionally, 360 organizations, right when the bill came out, wrote a letter to Congress opposing the bill due to its harmful provisions. Next slide, please. So this bill is also conflicting with a lot of our climate commitments, not just in the US, but globally. So, you know, even though a majority of LNG export infrastructure is located in the Gulf Coast, the impacts will reach all of us if we allow the build out to continue. At last year's COP28, former Vice President John Kerry led the United States to join nearly 200 nations in committing to an equitable transition away from fossil fuels. That was a huge moment for the globe in terms of our climate commitments. So we have this opportunity and this commitment to build a future where everyone does have access to affordable, reliable energy, clean air, clean water, and yet Congress is considering passing this dirty deal that would lock us into decades of fossil fuel infrastructure. Next slide, please. So this bill is gaining so much traction because it has a lot of political complexity. As I mentioned before, some Senate Democrats are feeling conflicted about this bill and potentially wanting to support it because they believe that the transmission and energy benefits will outweigh the harms, or they don't have a full understanding of how bad LNG truly is. If we were to ask them to approve a bill that had the same transmission and clean energy benefits, but also would force 150 new coal plants to open, I'm pretty sure that they would approach this differently. And I think that speaks to how much the LNG industry has obscured how genuinely harmful it is. And it starts with, again, that label of natural gas. It's truly methane gas, and it's not a bridge fuel, it's a fossil fuel. This is also politically complicated because this bill may also get attached to must-pass bills that are critical for government funding, which would make it even harder for senators to oppose it, even if they overall are not a fan of the bill. And examples of must-pass legislation includes continuing resolutions to avoid government shutdown, the NDAA defense spending bill, and even potential disaster relief supplemental packages, which, as we know, are in a lot of headlines because of the recent natural disasters we've seen in Florida and North Carolina. Next slide, please. So this is where our call to action comes in. This is where everyone who has joined us for this hour comes in, and we really appreciate it. Our call to action is twofold. We need national constituent support in urging key senators to oppose this fossil fuel giveaway. And we also need to ensure that the bill is not attached to any must-pass legislation that may come to the floor. So the timeline that we're looking at is that the bill passed out of committee a bit ago with semi-bipartisan support, as I mentioned, although I think it's important to highlight that Senator Sanders tried to get the LNG-related provisions removed from the bill through an amendment. The amendment did not ultimately pass, but it was supported by multiple Democrats, such as Senator Heinrich, who, because that amendment didn't pass, Heinrich ultimately ended up still overall supporting the bill, but that's a signal that he clearly wishes the LNG provisions were not there. So if we can convince senators that other permitting reform bills could exist and could pass without these harmful LNG provisions, we may be able to gain their opposition of the Energy Permitting Reform Act. We anticipate the vote for this bill to come in late November or December. So we aim to try to focus a lot of action with public participation in that window, particularly right after the election takes place. And of course, we don't know what will happen. There will be a lot more clarity and different strategies we can take based on the election results. And so looking at our targets, every state is a target for this. We want this opposition to be very, very widespread. However, there are some states where we've identified senators who are more likely to be swayed to oppose the bill. And those are listed below, those states on the screen. So we'll make sure that you have access to that list moving forward. Next slide. So take action. This is a link to our action alert. That is the number one most important thing you can do right now. We do plan to follow up following this webinar in the coming weeks with a toolkit and other information on how we can take action and different tactics that are mobilizing across the country. But signing the action alert and sharing it with everyone you can is very important. In addition to writing your members of Congress on both the House and the Senate side, that they need to oppose this bill based on the information that you now have as a tool, and also above all, stay centered in this messaging. Permitting reform does not and should not come at the expense of vulnerable communities or the climate, and it should not include giveaways to the fossil fuel industry. It doesn't have to be like this. It should not be like this. And by working with our action alert, staying informed on this issue, and staying engaged throughout November and December, it will be possible to gain opposition for this. Thank you so much.
Claire, you're amazing. That was such good information. Thank you so much. Please join us in taking action now. It's just a quick thing. Just go on there, click on the link, and go take action. Share with your friends. Post the link, the action alert link, to your social media. Share it on email. Send it to your mom right now. Whoever. We need signatures. We need to tell the folks on the Hill that we're not going to sacrifice more communities. So thank you, Claire. Amazing information. Over the past hour, we've been asking for your questions. Y'all did not disappoint. No way we're going to get through them all. But we're gonna at least get to a couple. Like I said earlier, we've got the list of questions. We're gonna type up some answers and share them around. So if you registered for this event, look for an email. We'll get you some answers. But I did want to start, and I'm just kind of picking some here. Claire, I know you've been talking a lot, but I'm going to put you on the spot for one here. What can we say to people who say we need LNG to keep energy prices low?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I love talking about this. I mentioned earlier that we know there's a direct correlation between the more we export LNG, the higher domestic energy prices become. So it's a very interesting situation. It doesn't keep energy prices low at all. In fact, keeping the gas here is what would theoretically keep prices lower, or obviously switching to renewables, which are much more cost effective. We have seen this in an example in the real world, which is a very unfortunate example. In Freeport, Texas, Freeport LNG had an explosion which was terrifying for the community and very irresponsible by the company. When that explosion happened and Freeport LNG stopped operating and therefore that gas capacity went down, there was a decrease in energy prices by a third, by 30%. And then as soon as it came back online, those energy prices went right back up. So that is a great example. There are a lot of articles about Freeport LNG, and that community deserves a lot of attention.
Thank you. Really, really great. So I'm going to ask this question. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe a couple of us can take turns at it. But how does Greenpeace or any other environmentally responsible group respond to arguments that LNG can act as a bridge fuel towards renewable energy while still contributing to global emissions? Who wants to take that one? Andreas?
Yeah, I can start and hands it off because there are so many different ways to answer this question. But to start with, I would respond that industry has tried this argument for decades, and yet they keep building more and more and more, and they keep backing off their already weak climate targets. The new projects that are seeking approval now will still be online in 2050 if the industry gets its way. And by then, we will have blown way past our global climate targets. So this makes it clear as day that it is a bridge to nowhere. And if anyone wants to get more into some of the specifics or other ways of answering this that have been useful to them, feel free to jump in.
No, Andreas, you're exactly right. The chief thing to be mindful of is the fact that it's not as clean as they say it is. Matter of fact, it's even been likened to be the carbon footprint is dirtier than that of coal itself. So if it's not clean, because that's what they always sold on, it's cleaner, so it's better, it's a bridge fuel, then why do we have the problems that we have with it? You know, if it's 80% worse than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, and hydrogen is 80% worse than it, because when it combines with methane in the atmosphere, it's even worse. Then we're not working real smart. So we got to follow the science, and we got to understand how all of this is interconnected, and make sure that we do this in such a way that we get out of fossil fuels as quickly as we can to get in clean, green, renewable energy. And that's going to take some work and some sacrifice and a lot of planning, but we all have to do it. And unfortunately, our government seems to want to do, as I've here in a meeting and we discussed today, do some of everything, you know, an all of everything approach. But all that does is impedes the transition that's so necessary. And I'm going to, shut up for a second, that a couple of years ago when I was at the, I guess you'd say, CERAWeek conference, John Kerry, who's the U.S. envoy on climate, said that to reduce our carbon footprint by 40% by 2030 would essentially crash the industry and crash the economy. But we can extend it out to 2050 to avoid the 1.5C, but we will shoot way past it. Just as you said, Andreas, we'll be in the 2.7 and 2.8 range. Well, by then, there will be no snow-capped mountains or peaks. There will be no polar caps. None of that will be here because we're already on a very slippery slope. We've reached the tipping point, I think, already. And it's not going to get any better unless we dramatically and drastically change what we're doing.
Thank you, John. Okay. Well said. Well said.
Yeah, I would add one other point too, that it's important to remember that LNG is really carbon intensive, that the energy that goes into it, it takes about twice as much energy to produce the life cycle carbon emissions of LNG, or at least double of what just regular methane is, because of all the leakage and all the energy that goes into compressing it. And our friends over in Europe need to also get their act together, and other countries around the world that are wanting this stuff. So there's a lot of geopolitical things going on with why they're wanting this fuel. So it's a global problem, but we're certainly in the United States playing a big part and the wrong part right now.
Thank you for that. Man, we have so many good questions in here. I'm going to move us on to another one. Melanie was asking, and Andreas, wait, actually, maybe it's Joe. I'm not sure. I'll let you all decide. Melanie was asking, when you looked at communities with LNG, did you look at, and Melanie's from Freeport, Texas, did you look at life expectancy in those areas? And can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, I can take that. And thank you, Melanie, for the question. So for our report, we looked at the Climate Vulnerability Index. And like I mentioned before, that's a cumulative assessment that takes into account many factors that include health outcomes for communities. Life expectancy is part of that. But what we didn't do is actually unpack all of that information and do a deep dive in the analysis there. And I think that's an important next step that we need to do. And it's something that, again, I think permitting agencies need to tackle, these very complex analyses, very in-depth analyses that these communities deserve. And I'll invite Professor Saha if he wants to add anything else to that.
I would have to go back and look at some of our findings to, offer specifics around, that area. But there's the CDC Places website that also is a mapping tool. So you can go there and tool around and see what it says and map out life expectancy. It's usually at the census tract level. I think they show it, but there's other, it seems like all the federal tools are now sharing the data. And so, I really encourage communities themselves to not depend on us eggheads to just go out and, try to figure out how to find that information yourself. So I really glad you're thinking along those lines. Happy to help if you get in touch too.
Thanks, y'all. I'm gonna go to, let's see if I can find it. There was a really, really great question that we may not have the exact answer to in this webinar, but I'm going to give you a preview into some upcoming reports. The jobs question. Where did it go? There was a question about, here we go. Do local people want or get jobs in the LNG facilities? Or are there other jobs? What is the union's position? Are these also barriers to closing down, aka forces on politicians to allow LNG? I'm going to start off, and I know John's got some thoughts on this, and maybe Claire. We are actually working on another report. It's a report on tax abatements. And so all these big corporations get massive tax breaks. They don't pay taxes in Louisiana and Texas. They don't pay all their taxes. And that has a huge impact on the regions. And the answer is it's complicated, but largely what we found is no, a lot of the communities, a lot of the folks in the communities hosting LNG facilities don't get the jobs. They go to people outside. John, I'm going to let you kick that off because I know you think a lot about this. And then maybe Claire, turn it over to you.
Yeah. Largely, those jobs are in part not union jobs because a lot of those union companies don't get that work. But what's worse about it is that the areas that they're doing these jobs in, unfortunately, have some of the highest unemployment in the state. So if they're talking about creating jobs and opportunities in those communities, then why isn't the situation any better? I was at a CCS meeting a week ago yesterday, and the county judge's representative in Jefferson County brought up the fact about tax abatement and all of what they're doing. And if we don't get the jobs, if we claw some of that money back that we were giving them in abatement. Well, I was in a previous meeting when I asked the mayor of Port Arthur that question and said, so how much money have you gotten back? But the other side of that is also that in not getting those jobs and opportunities, what are the barriers to it? The colleges and universities talk about all the people they train, but the question is not of training, it's of placement. And how many of those people from those communities? So as I told the county judge's rep, that if we are doing as much as we say with over, as the county judge said, 80 billion in industrial development in Jefferson County alone, why do we have poverty hovering near 30%? And why do we also have some of the highest unemployment in the state? There's something about that that's not being reconciled or it's not quite correct. We need to find out what it is, and we need to get to the bottom of it. So those jobs don't often go to those people. They go all throughout the region, and because of the lack of jobs in the northern tier, a lot of people are coming here. You can drive down the streets of most of these cities where these projects are, and you'll see license plates from every state in the union. I've seen them from far away as Alaska and Vermont, and you name it, they've been here. So, you know, that's just the way it is. It's not good, but that's the way it is.
Yeah, and I'll jump in to add that a lot of our coalition partners who are engaged in the fight against LNG exports are former refinery workers or former LNG workers. And I think that speaks a lot to the issues with the industry. And so, you know, they know that this isn't the future of the community. It has really decimated the local economy. And meanwhile, Texas and Louisiana, again, they are avoiding paying not millions of dollars in taxes, but multi-billions of dollars of taxes. In our report, you'll see that Louisiana alone avoids paying over $20 billion in taxes, which means that that's not going to the schools, it's not going to the infrastructure. And we will talk about in the report some of this crumbling infrastructure that you see that is very unsafe and frustrating for these communities, a lack of evacuation plans if these LNG terminals or other petrochemical facilities have any accidents. And also some of these communities, you drive around the area and you still see that they're struggling to recover from previous hurricanes. They're living in trailers provided by FEMA, and that is, you know, that should not be the case. There's a very wonderful article from James Hyatt that talks about how these communities, the roads should be paved in gold, but they are not receiving those taxes from the industries that are destroying the community. It's a really great article. Highly recommend looking it up. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I would add too that there have been some studies about employment, the workforce in the petrochemical industry, and Black Americans are largely excluded from those jobs. They make up about 10% of the workforce. A study that found that they earn 23% less than white Americans in industry, and that also Black Americans hold less than 4% of the jobs in the fracking industry. So very underrepresented. There's certainly some issues there, especially in these communities of color.
Thank you all so much for those answers. Really, really strong points. Anybody else want to jump in before we move on to the final question? All right. Just wanted to ask one more, and Andreas, maybe this one's for you. Who is supposed to be responsible when these numbers are out of the normal range?
Yeah, this is a great question to end on because I think it brings us partly back to our call to action, which is that when these projects are getting reviewed, they have to go through many different rounds of review under state and federal government. It's often FERC and the Department of Energy that need to take a hard look at the environmental impacts that these projects cause. The environmental impacts as well as the economic impacts under the public interest determination that Claire mentioned earlier. They should be responsible, but they are failing at their responsibilities and their obligations to actually take the hard look that they need to be taking. And that is a shame, and it's something that we cannot be complacent with.
And I'll add on to what Andre said here. So for the permit to kill analysis, we used an EPA tool. So this is something that's readily available for these agencies to use. They just have to go out and apply them. So that's something that we want to encourage folks to do. Also, critical to all of this, though we focused on health for permit to kill, there are many impacts that LNG have on communities and our planet. And with that, there should be a more cumulative impacts from LNG. So this includes, of course, health, the climate, but as we just discussed, economics and safety. And this is something that Professor Saha also highlighted in Claire as well. So this is something that we think agencies have a responsibility to do, to look at these cumulative impacts and to seriously consider these. And hopefully they find that LNG is not in the public interest, much like how we found in our analysis.
Thank you, Joe. I think we're going to have to wrap it up. We're 10 minutes over, which is amazing that we're only 10 minutes over. I'm really grateful to all our guests tonight, all our speakers, and your tireless work to help inform our movement, to move our this work forward. Each one of you and so many others play an important role in stopping this build out. There are a lot of people involved in making this event happen tonight. Too many to name, but it's such a joy to work with all of them. So grateful for you all. Most importantly, thanks for the 500 and something people that showed up tonight. I mean, amazing. What an amazing community of people. Y'all are amazing. What I'm going to ask, we're going to be sharing a recording of this presentation around. You're going to get a copy of it. You're going to get a link in the next couple of weeks. We ask you to share it. Share it with your friends. Share it with your family. Do a showing. You know, we really need to get people speaking out against this bill. We have to stop it. So thank you. We're going to be in touch soon about next steps in this important fight. Take the action alert tonight. Share it around. We need you to stay active. But until then, be strong, love and support your neighbor, and keep kicking ass. Thank you.